Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm your host, Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. And today we're discussing Russian invasion of Lithuania. Now, before you start asking about how you might have missed such big news, the invasion is hypothetical. It was part of the war game last year at German Bundeswehr's Helmut Schmidt University, where my guest in front of the show, Franz-Stefan Gady, played the role of the Russian Chief of General Staff. Now, in addition to his Gerasimov replacement role, he's an associate fellow for cyber power and future conflict at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, an adjunct senior fellow for defense at the Center for the New American Security, and the author of How the United States Would Fight China, The Risks of Pursuing a Rapid Victory, a new book we'll also dive into, as well as the latest developments on the Ukrainian front lines. Franz, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back.
All right. Well, let's start with this war game. So tell us about the structure of the war game, your role, and others that played along with you.
Well, first off, I think there was a bit of confusion when the first media reports were made about the results of the game back in December 2025, that it was an operational game. No, it was not. It was really a game primarily designed to test the German government's decision-making in a military crisis. So I did not have Russian forces fight NATO forces or test a particular force design or select military capabilities. So that's really important to understand. Because what I tried to do, or what my main job was as the chief of the general staff of the Russian Federation, was essentially to create a military crisis. And I had pretty much free hand to do so during the game. And frankly, I was responsible that the game took on more of a conventional military operation look, because I think the game designers essentially thought that they were simulating some sort of hybrid warfare scenario with cyber attacks, sabotage operations, something along the lines of Little Green Man in Lithuania, perhaps akin to what we've seen in 2014 on Crimea. But frankly, when I looked at the proposition and the scenario, the game was set in the summer of 2026. So actually, a couple of weeks from now. And also, I think it's important to understand context-wise that it assumed a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire, at least in Ukraine. But when I looked at how to best create a military crisis, I mean, best, quote unquote, of course, I quickly realized that Russia has a lot of conventional capability here. And I worked under the assumption that I could essentially use that conventional capability and capacity fairly quickly and actually hold a couple of advantages vis-a-vis NATO. So first off, I had speed, right? The assumption was that I, as the Russian side, was just much faster in my decision-making processes vis-a-vis the NATO alliance, also because of what is happening in the United States in terms of domestic politics and so forth. And from a pure practical perspective, the fundamental problem for NATO is that Russia, in any contingency, would already have a substantial amount of forces very close to the border of the Baltic states, in this particular case, Lithuania. And NATO, if we would look at the current, or if you assume that the current force posture holds, or that it's just incrementally going to be increased over the next couple of years, always will need to move its forces into the theater. I mean, not the theater, but at least the battle space, the Baltic status. And by doing so, it has to cross a fairly vulnerable spot, the Suwalki Gap, which is flanked by Kaliningrad, the Russian-held enclave, and then Belarus, and it would take time. And I assumed that I just had an advantage when it came to speed in terms of just rapidly escalating with conventional capabilities. The second assumption I had was that it would actually be possible to conduct a limited incursion into Lithuania with existing forces, even though forces would have been obviously depleted by the war in Ukraine. But I assumed that it would be possible to conduct smaller scale operations. Had a task force put together with around 12,000 Russian forces as sort of the spearhead. I had troops moving in from Kaliningrad and Belarus, and that it would be possible. But I think the most important element in all of this was my third assumption, that even if I would just be able to seize a fairly small amount of Lithuanian territory, I think I would be able to succeed in deterring NATO from counterattacking, particularly when it involves the German government, just because there's, as a non-nuclear power, the risk of nuclear war looms even larger over the heads of German political decision-making because they fundamentally distrust this concept of nuclear deterrence. At least this was my assumption going into the game, that they pay lip service to it, but at the end of the day, they're quite uncertain whether actually France, Great Britain, or even the United States would extend the nuclear umbrella to Eastern Europe. And so I thought that with a combination of speed and just having the initiative to move in forces fairly quickly, and then at the same time conduct a nuclear saber-rattling campaign, I would be able to deter a NATO counterattack. And these three assumptions by and large proved to be correct in the game. I completely overwhelmed German political decision-making by launching an incursion, launching this attack, and also essentially caught NATO wrong-footed. The United States was not willing to intervene, at least initially, because I assumed that the United States obviously would be willing to intervene at some point, but at least not within the first 48 to 72 hours, and that they would want the Europeans to take the lead. And then my assumption was that the Poles would not conduct a counterattack, to be honest, because all the statements we've had so far coming out of Poland basically tell us that Poland is not going to be a net security provider and would be very much occupied with defending Polish territory, particularly also because it's quite exposed Russian counterattacks via Kaliningrad or Belarus, and that the Germans would be very hesitant to act on their own, and that the German government and the German public never quite answered one of the first order questions. I'm always a big fan of first order questions, right? Would they actually really risk German lives for the defense of Lithuania? And would they actually risk or be willing to engage in nuclear brinkmanship over Lithuania? Or would they rather not immediately choose to negotiate and have a conversation, a dialogue with the Russians to avoid these hard choices? So that, in a nutshell, was basically the scenario. And I drafted a campaign plan, I think 10 or 12 pages for my political superiors, the foreign minister and then the president of the Russian Federation. And I walked them through all the different options. And in the event that there would have been a strong German response, I also developed a deep strike interdiction campaign plan to strike at the heartland of Germany and try to cut off NATO supply in Germany and
With
in other
missiles and
European
drones, or
countries.
just drones?
It would have been different attack packages depending on the target. So it would have been a combination of long-range drones combined with cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, depending on the target. The basic idea would have been to saturate German or NATO air defenses. And just to give you one number, by the end of this year, Russia will probably have produced over 120,000 Garand 2 or Shahid 136 type of long-range drones, each packed with 40 to 50 kilograms of explosives. And just a couple of hundred of those alone would be able to saturate pretty much the entire German air defense systems, to be honest. So if you talk about the plausibility of a scenario where a large chunk of Germany would actually very quickly become paralyzed because of the Russian drone strikes, I think it's fairly plausible, in my opinion, at least when I looked at the numbers and when I looked at the targets in Germany that I would need to hit in order to slow down NATO supplies. And I picked Germany over Poland because I thought that Poland, being the border state, would be much more heavily saturated with air defenses, and there are ways how you can circumvent essentially Polish air defense systems or air defense systems in the Baltics and along the eastern flank. And it's fundamentally a numbers problem that you have. Having said that, of course, we know that also the Russian military, when it comes to the air domain, has a couple of challenges and issues, but it has substantially improved, in my opinion, since 2022 in a couple of very key categories. So I assumed overall that it is a plausible scenario in the event that Germany actually would resist, to just really try to knock out Germany as a logistics hub, at least for a couple of days or so on, which would give me a tremendous advantage in my military operation in Lithuania. Now, I should say, and then I'm going to stop, there was a lot of media reporting on the game, and there was a big outcry in Lithuania, and a lot of Lithuanians reached out to me because I didn't factor in Lithuania in all of this. As a matter of fact, I did. In my plan, I had 2 brigade-sized Lithuanian elements that would offer resistance, and I had a specific plan how to essentially deplete them or knock them out or surround them and force them to capitulate. I also had a plan how to deal with the German brigade in Lithuania, and I have to say that I certainly said in the plan that this is a high-risk gamble to conduct an invasion. The idea was that we would move into Lithuania to establish a humanitarian corridor linking Kaliningrad with Belarus, essentially cutting through Lithuanian territory in the south, and under the assumption that there was a famine in Kaliningrad because Lithuania was cutting off supplies going into that Russian enclave. And it worked out in a way because we did get a lot of support in the game from far left, far right parties in various European countries also. So it involved an information warfare campaign. But all of this together created multiple issues for the German side, and they were completely overwhelmed. And at the end, Germany was so hesitant to act on its own without the support of the United States that we were able to establish this corridor, fortify our position, and essentially win the game. Having said all that, one other important element that I should emphasize here is that you can essentially cut off the Baltics without conducting a ground invasion. So the ground invasion, I also made that very clear in the game when I spoke to the Russian president and the foreign minister, was a nice add-on, quote unquote. In reality, you can cut off the Baltics with long-range fires from Kaliningrad and Belarus, remote mining, rocket artillery, essentially drones, and a couple of other capabilities that you could use there to essentially make it impassable for NATO forces, or NATO would have to conduct a substantial suppression of enemy air defense and destruction of enemy air defense campaign in the initial phase, and only the United States would be able to pull that off. And if you hold back the United States for a couple of days, you could create enough political pressure to essentially cut off the Baltics and get some concessions without actually having to invade. So it was a nice add-on, and a lot of people and the media was focused just on this invasion aspect. But in reality, they completely misunderstood that in reality, the Baltics were cut off because there were virtually no electronic warfare defenses, no air defenses, no drone defenses in Lithuania at that time. And I used open source intel to see what was essentially deployed in Lithuania, would likely be deployed in Lithuania in the summer of 2026. Also, border defenses, border fortifications would not have been completed by then. So Russia held a couple of advantages, but it still would have been a very, very high risk operation for Russia. And I did tell my political superiors that I also would have expected that it could end in failure within 24 hours. That is, just get bogged down on one of these roads in southern Lithuania, and that we wouldn't advance very far. But that was secondary to the fact that I would have been able to cut off Lithuania regardless.
All right. Well, a lot to unpack there. First of all, I should say, as someone who regularly designs a lot of war games, plays in a lot of war games are not predictive of the future, and they're not designed to be predictive. They're designed to exercise just these types of decision making and be presented with dilemmas so you can think through these various scenarios. Now, just to clarify a few points, so you did not get to Vilnius, right, the capital of Lithuania. You just you were in the south trying to cut off
Correct.
reinforcements for flowing in. Now, you mentioned Germany does have an armored brigade, about 5,000 troops in Lithuania today. Were they just in their
It's a lot
barracks?
less, actually. It's a lot less right now,
Oh, is
and
it?
they lack particular drone defenses, electronic warfare capabilities, and ground-based firepower. So it's a challenge.
Got it. But at a minimum, it's sort of a tripwire force in Lithuania. Were they staying in their barracks? Were they evacuated out of the country? Like, what happened to them in this war game?
Well, essentially, they were encircled. So it presented a couple of options. So one option I presented to my political leadership was an attack in Vilnius, and then essentially hitting the German brigade with everything that the Russian got. So long-range precision strikes, and essentially degrade them to the point that they couldn't offer any real resistance for the duration of the game. But my political leadership opted for the less escalatory approach, where essentially you would bypass the main positions of the German brigade and create facts on the ground, essentially by rapidly advancing and encircling them. And then through remote mining, the threat of a massive drone attack, and then also the threat of ballistic missile strikes, you essentially hold them hostage. And again, the assumption was maybe that's something that the German government would not be able to solve or would not actually want the Germans to resist. Of course, it never got to that stage. The German brigade didn't really make any moves in the game just because it wasn't an operational game. So I couldn't test out my operational propositions here. But what is clear is that the German brigade was fairly paralyzed because it didn't get any instructions from Berlin what to do. And yeah, it was not a major factor in all of this.
Now, the other assumptions you made is that you had the element of surprise, unlike 2022, when we had months of warning of what the Russians were going to do because of the incredible intelligence coups we had against them. And, not just intelligence coups, but, you and I and others were watching the mobilization that was taking place over the course of many months in the lead up to the war. So you assume that none of that is happening, in particular on the mobilization front, that you're using forces already deployed either for an exercise in Belarus or in Kaliningrad, right? So you don't have this.
Yes. So troops would already have been at the border, but the idea would have been, and again, I put that together on half a page, to essentially leave the equipment there, but rotate the forces out and then essentially conduct a shadow mobilization of these particular units again, but leave the equipment there after the end of the exercises and then quickly get these troops back. And then also basically within like 20 to 48 hours present NATO with, okay, there are like 4 combined armies at the border of all these Baltic states, and the Russians are demanding this and that. And still, it's unclear what exactly the Russians are going to do. So we combined it with we thought it was clever information warfare campaign where we left all the options on the table, but it was never very specific. So we didn't issue like an ultimatum like in December 2021 or something like that. That was sort of a deadly giveaway. If I remember what you were tweeting at the time or saying in public at the time as well.
Yeah. Well, so one thing that we should note as well, that this idea that NATO, in particular Germany, but frankly other countries in NATO, including the United States, the questions about their willingness to fight for the Baltics has been brought up even at the time of the inclusion of those countries into NATO, right? And the fact that this terrain is very, very difficult. Even the NATO war plans themselves reportedly talk about losing that territory and then fighting to retake it back because of the challenges of conducting a standard defense there. But what do you think are the implications for the Baltics themselves here? Obviously, the first thing that any country should do is focus on how it would defend itself, regardless of who may or may not come to their help. So what could they do? And I'll sort of ask a leading question here, because I've been advocating directly in my visits to the Baltics and other places that they should essentially be Iran, and particularly focus on long-range strike capabilities, that you're not going to have sufficient forces, land forces, to defend the territory. But if you can inflict massive pain on Russia, particularly major Russian cities like St. Petersburg, which is a stone's throw away, but even maybe Moscow, with long-range strikes that have the payload, so not just, drones, but predominantly missiles and hopefully even ballistic missiles, which they don't have today, that would create a massive deterrent effect for Russia. How do you think about
I think it would need to be a combination of the two. So on the one hand, I think you're right in terms of longer range strike capabilities. One of the major challenges of the Baltics is that they really lack depth. So it's very difficult to conduct a maneuver defense, essentially. Not that the militaries of the Baltic countries would be able to actually engage in maneuver defense and conduct combined arms operations at scale in the first place, just because they lack capabilities, they lack training as well. They're building up the forces and they're formidable. Don't get me wrong, but I think if you want to respond to Russian incursion according to NATO military doctrine, there's still a long way to go in all European militaries. I'm not singling out the Baltics here. I'm talking about the Germans, all the other militaries on the continent, but including the United Kingdom, the British Army. So there's a lot we need to relearn in this regard. But when we think about how NATO would likely defend the Baltics, one political issue immediately comes to mind, and that is, what do you do when you have to cross the Russian border? Just in terms of, what do you do when you cross the threshold of essentially conventional defense to conventional defense that could trigger a nuclear response? And this, I think, needs to be tied into this whole debate about longer
And by
range
the way, this was
positions.
a dilemma for the Ukrainians as well, right? It took months, if not longer, for the Ukrainians to start striking across the border into Russia.
Exactly. But you know what? At NATO and within European governments, I don't think we've really done our homework there just yet when it comes to the defense of the Baltics. Because if you look at the structure of a NATO core, for example, and the range or the depth it's supposed to be striking, I mean, when you look at the Baltics, you superimpose the different borderlines and ranges. St. Petersburg, as you said, it would be in range of a NATO core, essentially. It potentially could be with certain capabilities within the range of a NATO division already. So you would have these commanders making decisions that could potentially have disastrous political consequences. Of course, this is not what would happen. And so I would say that there are political limitations to what maneuver defense could actually accomplish in the case of the Baltics, because if you cross into Russia and Russia threatens with retaliation, if you threaten certain high value targets in the Leningrad military district, if you strike dual capable systems, for example, Iskander and short range ballistic missile sites and units and so forth. I mean, there are a lot of dilemmas here that immediately come to mind when it comes to all of this threat of vertical escalation. And this is also why I wrote the book, How the United States Would Fight China, essentially, because I think the vertical escalatory dynamics there based on how we would assume, that is, we, the West, NATO, the United States, would actually conduct a military campaign based on multi-domain operations, information dominance, cognitive superiority, whatever doctrinal language you want to use here and concept. All of this poses a lot of escalatory threats, or at least dynamics, that I don't think the political leadership in any of these countries is actually aware of. And so I think in terms of how you would structure the Baltic defense, it would be a combination of striking targets in the Leningrad military district, I think, first and foremost, or in Belarus, in Kaliningrad. But at the same time, also really try to have enough quantity on the ground to just fight delaying actions as long as you can, launch local counterattacks, just keep the Russians essentially under constant pressure and not allow them to essentially supply the superior firepower. So I think it would have to be some sort of, I mean, akin to maybe what we've seen in 1940 during the Soviet-Finnish War. And I think that is actually the war that has been studied by a lot of the Baltic militaries. But at the end of the day,
The terrain is very different there, right?
the terrain is different. Of course, it's different, right? But still, last time I traveled through the areas that I actually included in the war game, or where I would send my forces over, actually a year ago, pretty much, I think it must have been June last year. And there's a lot of territory that you can use for ambushes and where you can actually conduct localized counterstrikes. And also there are a lot of urban settlements down there that you can use, because I think one thing is clear also, that Russia would want to circumvent, if possible, a lot of the urban terrain here and not get bogged down in urban combat. But again, here, the issue is that you need a combination of deterrence by denial posture within the Baltic countries, and then a deterrence by punishment posture when it comes to hitting targets in Russia. And based on these two principles, you would create your force structure, the force design, and will come up with your plans first, and then create the force structure and force designs, and then feed it with the capabilities that you need.
Which is not happening, right? That's the
Well, I
punchline.
mean, there's a lot of experimentation going on. There's a lot of, I mean, I'm not too pessimistic. I think a lot of things are happening. They're not happening systematically, they're happening slowly. But I do think there's a realization within the German Bundeswehr, for example, what it takes to beat back an initial Russian attack. And they're working towards closing certain capability gaps quite quickly.
Well, I mean, in
Particularly,
the Baltics specifically, not just across the NATO alliance, but also, it's been remarkable to me to see this lack of focus on the development of indigenous ballistic missiles across the European NATO contingency. This is something that was clear long before even this Iran conflict was going to be really, really important. And we have, of course, this missile export control regime that makes it difficult to cooperate with countries on the development of this technology. This is one of the reasons why you don't see really any startups that are emerging in sort of the new defense tech ecosystem that are doing drones. Some of them are even doing cruise missiles, but pretty much no one that I know of is doing ballistic missiles. That's a big problem in my opinion. What do you think?
well, you have a couple of interesting startups that actually joined, that entered into joint ventures or strategic partnerships with some of the more established primes in Europe. to produce cruise missiles. Of course, a different capability, but ballistic missiles, yes, you're absolutely right. There's a deficit there. Companies that I've talked to that are working, for example, on cruise missiles, frankly, I would not have thought that that would have been possible a couple of years ago, that you actually have a serious European company enter that field. So let's see what's going to happen.
Yeah, I just look at just even the combined GDP of the three Baltic countries. It's about two-thirds of the GDP of Iran with a much smaller population. So if Iran can produce thousands of ballistic missiles, the Baltics themselves could absolutely do that as well. And, I think it needs to be a big area of focus.
Yes, but you know what? That would mandate a larger debate about some of the issues that I have just raised when it comes to escalatory fears, this idea of being comfortable with nuclear brinkmanship. I mean, it opens up an entire new can of worms, essentially, that you need to deal with at the political level in all of this. And I think it's a slow process. Hopefully, we'll get there sooner than later. I'm sure we're going to get there eventually. But this is not just about lacking the technological capability, as you put it. There's a whole political dimension to it. And even within NATO, and this includes actually the United States, there's a lot of concern about escalation in any of these scenarios. And the United States has been actively discouraging for a long time a lot of European countries from actually not developing these particular kind of capabilities until a while ago because of all these escalatory concerns that they had, at least prior to 2021.
Of course, one of the side effects of the U.S. reducing its force posture in the region, there have been questions about U.S. commitment to NATO, is that it actually unleashes a lot of these countries to focus on doing what they think is best for their own security without necessarily listening to the United States, right? As you've seen Ukraine get much more aggressive on the battlefield in this war and striking Russian targets that the U.S. in the past has actually said, they should stay away from, like energy targets. Now they're doing it pretty much unabated, in part because their dependency on the United States has been reduced so much that they're much less willing to listen to what we think, right? So there is an effect there. Let's switch topics here and talk about China, right? So you wrote a book on this issue. I had a book on this a few years ago, World on the Brink, how America can beat China in the race of the 21st century. You talk about how America could lose to China in your book. Basically, the big thesis in the book is that the United States should not count on a short campaign, that this will be likely a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, given the challenges of our defense industrial base, we're going to be basically outpaced in munitions production and a whole slew of weapon systems by China. Is it an accurate characterization?
Yes, it is. If I can add on, my main impetus to write the book was actually a critique on US operational concepts, US military doctrine, and some basic US assumptions about the future of warfare. And one of it being this idea that the United States, no matter under what kind of scenario, would be able, even if it's temporary, to attain information superiority, cognitive dominance, that is, it would actually be able to faster close kill chains, that is, linking sensors and shooters, and more quickly than the PLA identify targets in the battle space, hit these targets, track these targets, and then eventually hit these targets accurately, and essentially based on a systems warfare theory, would hit key nodes of the PLA or the Chinese military systems. And by hitting these key nodes, the system would eventually collapse. Because at the end of the day, that's sort of the philosophy of the Western way of warfare or the NATO way of warfare, because it's obviously mostly military thinking when it comes to this. And my
We
point
don't
was
like
always,
long wars, right? Even though sometimes we end
yes,
up
I mean, the
fighting them.
assumption is that you would actually, that it would be a rapid, decisive, well, that it would be rapid, decisive warfare that would essentially result in rapid, decisive results. Although there obviously are a lot of people, a lot of scholars, a lot of military theorists in the United States arguing that that's not going to be the case. And it's also the Joint Chiefs have written briefs on the subject that I studied, who are also pointing out that it's not going to be a short, brief war. But the fact is that the force structure hasn't changed and doctrine hasn't really been substantially adopted to this new
So let me
reality.
push back on this
Yeah.
because the big difference, of course, with the China-Taiwan conflict, there are numerous, but the big one is that this is a maritime domain, not a land domain that you're seeing in Ukraine. And the problem that China has is that it needs an enormous sea lift capacity to carry, I think over 1 million troops ultimately to the island to try to occupy and pacify it, right? In the case of Taiwan invasion. And I think one of the core assumptions for the United States, and you see this being discussed by Admiral Papar, the head of Indo-PACOM, and others, this hellscape concept, where if you sink that fleet, there is no invasion, right? Now, you can still pummel Taiwan and, frankly, regional bases, American bases with rockets, with missiles, and so forth, but that does not win a war, right? You need ground troops to occupy territory to ultimately win the conflict, in the case of Taiwan, to actually occupy this country. And if you can't get them there, there's no victory. So I think the assumption in the U.S. war plans may be that, you target the fleet, you sink it. Now, there is a question, of course, does it escalate potentially even to the nuclear level there? But at least from a denial perspective, you've accomplished your primary objective. Do you disagree with that?
Yes, but my issue, and I wrote about this in the book, is what's happening after you sink the invasion fleet, right? How do you take that tactical success and tie it into an overall theory of victory for your own side, particularly if you know that sinking this fleet would actually deplete a substantial amount of your precision-guided munitions? And how do you prevent the Chinese just playing for time? And I think that's sort of the larger issue here. We see.
But wait a second, Franz.
Hmm?
Let me challenge you on this. What do you mean playing for time? Because the objective for China is to take Taiwan, right? So you've denied them their primary objective, right? So they're not going to rebuild this fleet in a year or 2 years. This would be an enormous.
My point would be that you wouldn't necessarily need to have that invasion fleet when it comes to Taiwan, right? I mean, you could also just range it with a lot of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, saturate air defenses, horizontally escalate the conflict to tie down U.S. forces somewhere else. If you look at it just as a problem of sinking 300 ships and maybe degrading air defenses on the coastline, and I think the issue is that there are so many other options that the Chinese can pursue here. Look,
but hold on, Franz. An air campaign has never won a war. Maybe you can count Kosovo, maybe, and there was a threat of land invasion there back in 1999. But other than that, there's never been a case where just purely through missile strikes and bombing campaigns, you can take territory, get them to surrender. So I think the Chinese appreciate that as well as we do. So it would be a punishment campaign, but it would not actually accomplish the objective for China. I mean, look at Ukraine, right? It's getting pummeled for the last 4.5 years by Russia, and Russia's not winning and getting Ukraine to surrender.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right about that. And I write about that in the book. And I also say that the likely outcome is that neither side is going to win. And my main point is that, and that's where what you mentioned comes in, the attritional factor in all of this. How much would the United States be willing to do in this regard in terms of deterring or fighting a prolonged war of attrition against the PLA in this matter? If, like, after the initial sinking of the fleet, the initial destruction that both sides caused on each other, how does this conflict unfold essentially, right? I mean, is it going to be a stalemate? Is it something similar to what we're seeing now in the Gulf, right? That's my main concern, this sort of decoupling from the tactical and the operational and strategic level that I don't think has anything to do with the current presidential administration and has a lot to do with how the United States or NATO in general, that's why I picked this topic as well, because so much of the debate on how to fight China actually trickles down into debates on military doctrine here in Europe as well. It's much more a quintessential element of how we conduct our military operations here. And yes, you can destroy the PLA's fleet, you can destroy the PLA Air Force and a lot of other military assets. On the one hand, you have vertical escalatory dangers that I also outlined, that already have outlined also with the scenario in the Baltics. But on the other hand, there's a fundamental flaw in our approach to systems warfare that I see in how we would conduct such a campaign. And it assumes that we almost have near perfect information about the adversary system. And I think that's a dangerous assumption, because only based on that assumption can we assume that a military campaign can be quick and decisive. And so unless we change our force structure, and that is, unless we also address our defense industrial bases, produce a lot more of these precision-guided munitions, because a lot of it will be wasted on targets that don't hold that much value, I think we could actually end up in a situation where we will be very successful at the tactical level, like in Iran right now, but we're not going to be able to translate that into any political political objectives. And I think that that's sort of the real danger for a great power, not to
Yeah.
be defeated, but that it's, it's a drain on resources, and there are always opportunity costs involved with great powers when it comes to that.
Right. So I mean, the question you're really raising, which is a very good one and one that a lot of people are thinking through, is the phase two, right? The phase one, I think, for the United States, a great deal of focuses on this, frankly, for China as well, is the maritime dimension, the fleet for China. How do you get across and land and fight a land war there? Although most analysts believe that, if they have enough lodgements on the island that they can resupply, it's going to be basically over. But if they can't and you sink the fleet, the invasion, the threat of invasion is over perhaps for a generation or more. But then what comes next, right? And as you rightly point out, Xi Jinping at that point, having lost his navy, probably lost hundreds of thousands of troops, is not going to say, well, we tried that, let's go home. Right? Just like Putin, after the Battle of Kiev was lost and he did not accomplish his initial objective, did not say, well, that was that. Let's end this thing, right? There is a natural tendency to double down, the sunk cost fallacy, and continue. For China, it's a much harder decision, right? Putin can continue flowing forces across the border because it's a land invasion. For China, you do have a decision to make of, okay, we can now resort to a punishment campaign, an air campaign that maybe will, we hope against all historical evidence will cause the Taiwanese to surrender. But, our ability to land massive force on the island is no longer feasible. But, chances are that they would continue in some sort of fashion, particularly targeting our own infrastructure and bases in Japan and Guam, maybe the Philippines, depending on whether the Filipinos will give us the ability to strike China from there. And how do you continue that war and how do you de-escalate it and make sure it never gets to the nuclear domain is obviously a key question. Now, we can hold a lot of assets in China, in mainland China, at risk as well, right? As can the Taiwanese. And I've been arguing to the Taiwanese the same thing, frankly, I've been arguing to the Baltics and others, is you need your own long-range strike capability, indigenous production, so you can hold mainland China at risk. And you can, for example, target most of the ports, which, by the way, mostly face Taiwan within striking distance of Taiwanese, even indigenous missiles, so that you can shut down shipping into China, right? And blockade China if you have to, so you can cause them enormous pain. So there are things that both we and particularly the Taiwanese can do to inflict enormous damage on the Chinese as well. So it's not like we're without options.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the fundamental question again here is a political one. And I think that sort of factors in. And I end my book with that. At the end of the day, how much is Taiwan really worth to us, that is the United States, and how much is it really worth to China? And what are we willing to pay for achieving essentially our objectives there? And for a great power, the question is, and I put that in the last couple of paragraphs in the book, even if you succeed and you defend Taiwan, you prevent the Chinese from seizing Taiwan, but maybe you lose 10, 20, 30% of your navy in the course of doing so. Is it really worth it for a great power in terms of all the other issues that are out there? And that's, of course, a question that maybe we can't answer in this podcast. That's more of a grand strategy question. But I think for me, it's really the fundamental question behind all of this. Is it really worthwhile having this fight to begin with? Even if it's less plausible now, I would say under the Trump administration than maybe under other administrations. But I obviously can't predict the future here.
The goal is never to fight. The goal is to deter fighting, right?
To deter the fight, yeah. And I have to tell you, based on my last visit to Taiwan, it's also unclear to me essentially what the Taiwanese position in all of this is and how Taiwan would react. I don't know. There are Taiwan experts who know this much better, but talking to the Taiwanese military.
Yeah, I spent a lot of times on this, Franz. I think the Taiwanese will fight, but how they fight and how long depends greatly on what the United States does, right? If they think they're all alone and no one is coming to their aid, they know it's basically a lost cause. It shouldn't be, but given their preparedness level, given where they stand in the atrophy of their defense industrial base over the last 45 years or so, that's been a huge problem, longstanding problem that they're trying to focus on, but politically it's very challenging given that the opposition is preventing the special budget from getting passed through their legislature and significant challenges with reform in the military and so forth. But if they think that they're alone and it's hopeless, no one wants to be the last man to die for a lost cause, those issues will come to bear on the fight. If we're in, I do think they fight, and particularly if they focus now, today, on long-range strike capabilities and do what we may not be willing to do, which is hit the Chinese mainland right off the bat and cause them huge pains. I think that this can dramatically change the nature of the conflict.
Yes, and as I point out in the book, it's very unclear to me whether the United States would actually be willing to hit the Chinese mainland or not. So I guess your assumption is that the United States most likely would not.
Well, at least initially, I think it would be hard, right? You'd focus on the fleet itself and try to prevent escalation because hitting the Chinese mainland probably means the U.S. mainland gets hit, right, with intercontinental ballistic missiles. And for any president, that's a very hard thing to accept, no matter whether Golden Dome is deployed or not, and depending on how effective it is. Let's switch topics again for the last few minutes of the podcast to Ukraine. So you were just in Ukraine back in March. We haven't covered Ukraine lately on the podcast, but this year we're seeing pretty significant changes on the front line where the Ukrainians are largely able to curtail Russian advances, have some tactical counteroffensives as well, small ones, but nevertheless, the tide seems to be shifting. And I don't want to overstate it that Ukraine is about to retake all of its lost territory or anything like that. I think that's still pretty unlikely. But clearly, the Russian side is getting more and more exhausted. Almost 4.5 years in, the economy is under enormous strain, despite the fact that oil prices are significantly higher today because of the Iranian conflict. And you are starting to see some elements of the Russian regime start talking about the end of this war. You had, for the first time in many years, Putin actually calls Zelensky out by name. Usually he says the junta in Kiev, this legitimate regime. And he actually said Mr. Zelensky, which I almost fell off my chair when I was listening to that. So there is indications that this war is much closer to the end than it was to the beginning. I still think that he's likely to try to get through another winter. He seems to count on winters as sort of a best opportunity to break the Ukrainian resistance. But it could potentially end sooner as well. But probably, in the next year or so, we're going to see this conflict grind to a halt, is my view on this. How do you see it, and what do you think of the changes at the front?
Yes, I mean, I can only really look a couple of weeks ahead, to be honest, just because it's such a complex undertaking in terms of analysis that I'm very often overwhelmed when I look at just different sides of this conflict. But by and large, I think Ukraine is in a better position in 2026 than it was in 2025. It has certainly made progress on a couple of key issues, including manpower. The Ukrainian armed forces are no longer shrinking in comparison to 2025. There has also been some progress when it comes to addressing the convoluted chain of command within the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian high command is no longer building additional or standing up additional units filled with inexperienced personnel that makes the combat value of these units very much, or throws it very much into question. So the Ukrainian armed forces are better at force management, and they now have an advantage, I would say, or at least parity on select parts of the front line in unmanned warfare, both on the ground and in the air. On the ground, I think it's primarily the result of Elon Musk's decision to cut off Starlink from the Russians. The Russians used a lot of Starlink terminals for conducting essentially unmanned ground operations, resupply missions, and so forth, and they can no longer.
By the way, can we just put a pause on this, because this is incredible to me, right? We brought up this issue of Starlink terminals being used by the Russians going back like 3 years when you and I were both in Kiev. Where I think we were talking about this on the train ride back. And we're talking that all you need is sort of an allow list type of approach where you say, here are the Ukrainian terminals, turn off everything else in this area of responsibility that's not matching those serial numbers. The fact that it took them 3 years to go to Musk and ask for this is just mind-boggling to me. And look at the effect that it's had, to your point.
I mean, it certainly had an effect, for sure. I don't think we should exaggerate the impact, but certainly what has happened is that it helped Ukraine gain the upper hand in unmanned warfare, at least for the next period of counter-adaptation, counter-adaptation, right? That perpetual cycle. In warfare, it certainly contributed to it. The larger issue, though, for the Russians is that Ukraine also has gained the advantage when it comes to mid-range strike capabilities. This was something that my colleague Michael Kaufman, Conrad, Rob Lee, they've been pointing that out for almost all of 2025 that's an issue, a capability gap that needs to be addressed. And also, when we were conducting interviews with brigade commanders, soldiers behind or very close to the front line, that's one issue they always told us about. We see the enemy, we see the Russian scattering. We record the videos, but we can't hit them with anything because it's beyond our capability to strike these targets. And now the Ukrainians can actually strike assembly areas, high value targets like radar systems, Russian supply lines. And it actually threw Russia into a dilemma, similar to what happened to the Ukrainians in 2024 and early 2025, trade-offs essentially between, do we defend this particular part of the front line with short-range air defenses, or do we move them back into Russia because of Ukraine's long-range strike campaign into Russia proper, because Russia particularly lacks now short-range interceptors. So that's a real issue. So cumulatively, or the cumulative effect in all of this is that the situation for Russia militarily does not look as good in 2026 than in 2025. Having said all of that, I just recently talked to someone who just returned from the Donbass, a Ukrainian soldier, and he tells me the military pressure on the front line is relentless. I mean, the Russians are pushing into Konstantinivka. That seems to be now the main focus, at least for the last couple of days. They still try to enable this pincer movement north of Sloviansk and from Konstantinivka and on from Pokrovsk to Topropilia, and essentially encircle the remainder of the Donbass. And the Ukrainians are getting under increased pressure here, and casualties are mounting. So Russia by no means is defeated. And we have to see how the next adaptation and counter-adaptation cycle unfolds. Having said that, it's not quite clear to me what the Russians are going to do next. Are they going to actually mobilize, or a new shadow mobilization, because they're suffering? The quality of the infantry, overall ground forces is going down. Units such as Rubicon or their version of mid-range strike and strikes deeper behind the Ukrainian front lines, they've been able to scale. They've been able to scale up additional formations, new units, but these units have not been as effective. I mean, one of the reasons why I was more pessimistic last fall, for example, the fall of 2025, was because I thought once they would be able to scale up these new concepts on unmanned warfare, that and because of their ability to much more effectively echelon essentially the front and parcel it up and really target Ukraine drone logistics and Ukraine drone units, that at some point the Ukrainian defense system could actually collapse on parts of the front line. Turns out that has not been the case for multiple reasons. But I mean, what are the Russians going to do next? That's the big question here. What can they do to negate Ukraine, essentially, this parity or advantage in unmanned warfare? And the answer to me is not very obvious, to be honest.
Well, the Ukrainians believe that the Russian military has promised, and who knows how many times that promise has been made to Putin, that they would take Donbass this year. It doesn't seem like they're in any position to do so, and they're continuing to grind it and take some territory, but the rate of advance has slowed down dramatically. I want to get your take on our friend Rob Lee's statement on X that he just posted, that he says the arguments that drones have made maneuver warfare obsolete or impossible are totally wrong, and that cheap intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and strike drones are enabling an interdiction campaign at operational depths without air superiority that Ukraine could not even achieve with HIMARS and ATACMS back in 2023. And that, with this destruction and effective suppression of the Russian UAS positions, Ukraine can set conditions for employing armor again. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that 100%. And Rob and I and Mike and Conrad, we've been to one of these units that actually that has been quite effective in conducting combined arms operations and offensive operations against the Russians by effectively synergizing or synchronizing a lot of the effects and of different capabilities on the battlefield, and by doing so, essentially negating the drone threat through combination of kinetic defensive measures, but also jammers. So a combination of the electromagnetic spectrum and kinetic elements, but also a combination of artillery, armored vehicles, different means to strike the adversary. So yes, I'm absolutely 100% agree with that statement. And I think the issue from a doctrinal discussion perspective is, again, the basic question: is this evolution of unmanned warfare in the lower altitudes of the air domain, so let's say from 0 until 4,000 meters, is this going to, even more so than in the past, decouple the airspace, or essentially the entire air picture in terms of air superiority? Can you achieve essentially temporary air superiority in the lower domains of the air domain, while at the same time not really projecting any air power above that? And that's a debate that you can't really resolve, but I think that's the key to me to unlocking essentially maneuver again on the battle space, right? Because our assumption within NATO is that essentially, because we have superior air forces, because a lot of our firepower is up in the air, we have, that much more advantages in the air domain against the Chinese Air Force, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, and the Russian aerospace forces and so forth, that we actually always will be able to conduct maneuver warfare type of campaign or influenced campaign. And to me, that's a dangerous assumption, right? Because if you decouple the airspace, you can pretty much, have a situation like Israel had in Lebanon over the last couple of months, or even in Gaza, where you can perfectly control and exercise air superiority in the upper altitudes, but you still can get hit by drones. You can still actually take casualties, and you can still get bogged down in urban combat and other operations, right? And I think drones are just amplifying that effect. So at the end of the day, to me, it seems to me that, yes, combined arms operations, or proficiency in combined arms operations, integration of new capabilities, that's going to be the key to unlock maneuver, not any particular technological capability. And so, yes, I really am very hesitant. I was always very hesitant to say that type of warfare no longer exists based on the experience in Ukraine.
That is a really fascinating point that, for the last 100 years since the invention of air power, we've been talking about air superiority, air supremacy in one airspace. But maybe it's time to decouple the airspaces, high altitude, low altitude, because the Lebanon example is a perfect testament of that, right? That Israel controls the high altitude. And you could argue Hezbollah kind of controls the low altitude with the FPV drone strikes on Israeli land forces there. So we'll end on that note and the constant changing nature of war. Franz, good to see you. Hope you come back again soon, and we'll see each other maybe in Ukraine or Taiwan or elsewhere.
Sounds good. Thanks again for having me.
Take care.